Welcome to the deep dive. We are going straight past the surface level talking points and diving into the most challenging, dense intellectual framework to give you the precise, insightful shortcut to understanding what truly matters in political conflict.
Today we are cracking open political theorist Corey Robin's highly provocative and deeply researched book, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism, from Edmund Burke to Sarah Palin.
And right off the bat, if your working definition of conservatism is just, prudence, tradition, or a preference for small government, you should probably prepare for that definition to be fundamentally challenged.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
That's really the central point. Our mission in this deep dive is to understand Robin's core thesis, which is that conservatism isn't a static defense of the way things are.
Right.
It's an active, it's a persistent, and historically a highly successful counter-revolutionary doctrine. It's always looking backward, yes, but it acts with this incredible dynamism.
And it's not just reacting to big ideas like socialism. The reaction is aimed at something much more personal, right?
Exactly. He says, and this is a direct quote, that it's the theoretical voice of this animus against the agency of the subordinate classes.
Agency. That's the key word.
That is the key word. He argues conservatism is forged in a direct, often furious reaction to movements demanding freedom, equality, and rights from below, whether that's from women, enslaved persons, workers, or the poor.
So we're going to trace this idea through some genuinely surprising figures. We'll be looking at how Thomas Hobbes completely redefined liberty to serve absolute power.
And how antebellum slave owners justify this radical idea of democratic feudalism.
We'll also touch on Justice Antonin Scalia's fight to preserve inequality in, of all places, competitive sport. And of course, the warrior ethos of Ayn Rand.
And we'll wrap up by looking at this deep, often unacknowledged psychological drive that Robin identifies within conservatism. This desire for conflict and the quest for what he calls the sublime.
The goal, as always, is to give you the tools to analyze political arguments, especially when they invoke big concepts like freedom and loss, to get you thinking about what might really be going on underneath.
It's a powerful framework.
Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start with that central argument, because it really does set his analysis apart from almost everything else. Robin says the true conservative target isn't the policy being proposed, it's the source of the demand.
Exactly. When we look at history, we tend to focus on the reforms themselves. Things like, say, raising the minimum wage or allowing women to own property, factory safety regulation.
The nuts and bolts of the policy.
Nuts and bolts. But Robin says we need to distinguish the policy from the fundamental insult that the superior class is experiencing.
And what is that fundamental insult? What's so vexing?
It's the sheer existence of an insistent and independent voice of demand coming from below.
So it's not about the cost of the safety guards on the machine.
Not primarily. When superiors push back, they are fundamentally vexed by the assertion of agency. It's the fact that the subject class is becoming an agent, speaking and acting on their own behalf. That's the real threat.
Can you give us a really sharp historical example of this, where the issue is just so clearly about agency and not the policy itself?
The historical justification for marital rape is, well, it's horrifyingly clear on this point. It was legal in every U.S. state until 1980.
Which is shocking to even say out loud.
It is. And the legal foundation for it goes all the way back to an English jurist, Matthew Hale, in 1736.
What was his argument?
He argued that when a woman gets married, she gives an implicit, unretractable consent to her husband, which she cannot retract.
So by saying yes once at the altar, she could never say no again, ever. And a judge's job was simply to uphold that structural feature of the contract.
Precisely. And you see a similar logic in the 19th century employment world. Judicial interpretations of labor contracts often served as a, quote, conduit to unforeseen coercion and constraint. Well, a worker might consent to be hired, right? But judges would then rule that this initial consent contained all these implicit provisions of involuntary servitude. It essentially nullified any later demand for better conditions or even the ability to just easily quit.
So the superior's resistance, whether it's the husband or the boss, is a way of ensuring that that private contract remains a sphere of just unquestioned, unequal power.
Yes. It has to be sealed off from whatever democratic ideas are floating around outside. The real outrage is when the subordinate person tries to renegotiate those hidden involuntary clauses.
And there are these incredible moments in history where this assertion of agency is seen as the revolutionary act itself, even when there's no violence.
Absolutely. One of the most prominent spokesmen for the slaveholding class, John C. Calhoun, is a perfect example.
Right. When he looked back at the crisis that led to the Civil War, what did he identify as the point of no return? It wasn't what you'd expect.
Not at all. He didn't point to a major law or a battlefield loss. He identified the moment in the mid-1830s when Congress decided to merely receive abolitionist petitions.
Just to receive them, even if they were going to table them or ignore them immediately after.
The mere existence of that speech, the fact that these demands were heard and allowed to enter the political system, that was a signal that, in his words, the revolution had begun.
The audacity of the formerly silent speaking publicly is the revolution. It's an incredible idea.
And this dynamic isn't just an American thing. Robin points to the 1952 agrarian reform in Guatemala, which aimed to redistribute land to peasants.
The ruling classes complained about losing property, I assume?
Of course. But the Archbishop of Guatemala focused his anger on something else entirely. He complained that the reform's greatest evil was that it unleashed a riot of political talk.
A riot of political talk. Wow, what a phrase.
Isn't it? Progressive reformers had sent local peasants, many of whom were described as gifted with facility with words, to the capital to speak publicly. And the ruling class saw the sudden, articulate entry of these formerly landless, silent people into political discourse as the true disruption.
It's the talking that's the chaos, not the land redistribution.
Political talk by the subordinate class equals chaos. And this fear also kicks into high gear when subordinates prove they can govern themselves, when they make the superiors redundant.
That has to be terrifying to an established elite.
The American labor movement has some really powerful examples of this. During the Great Upheaval of 1877, striking railroad workers in St. Louis and other places essentially organized their own city administration.
So they didn't just stop the trains.
No, they took to running the trains, not for profit, but to provide basic city services to make sure necessary supplies were still moving. They stepped right into the role of management.
And the owners must have been horrified.
They panicked. They effectively launched a strike of their own. They refused to manage anything, just to prove that the system had to fall apart without their superior direction.
Because the strikers were demonstrating that self-governance was possible.
Which is the ultimate anti-hierarchical act.
And you see this again in the Seattle General Strike of 1919, which, you could argue, took it even further. The workers provided everything from law and order to infant milk supply.
They did their job too well. The mayor of Seattle was deeply alarmed. He later called this quiet, orderly action, which had no violence, an attempted revolution.
Why? Because it worked.
Because it proved that revolution doesn't need violence. He said it puts the government out of operation, and that is all there is to revolt, no matter how achieved. When the workers successfully created order without the boss or the state, they proved the ruling class was unnecessary. That redundancy is the revolution.
Which brings us to a crucial point in the argument, the need to maintain these private dominions.
Exactly. The public sphere might have to grudgingly adopt democracy, but private spheres, the home, the plantation, the workplace, those must remain domains of unchallenged, unequal power.
And the American revolutionaries themselves, the ones fighting for liberty, they immediately panicked when those same principles were applied a little too broadly to their own private worlds.
John Adams is the perfect case study here.
When his wife, Abigail, famously wrote to him suggesting the new government should remember the ladies and not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husband.
He was clearly shaken by that.
He didn't just dismiss her. His response sounds genuinely terrified of the cascade effect.
It does. His letter back lists all the insubordination already rampant in the colonies. He says children and apprentices were disobedient, Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters.
A whole world turning upside down.
And then Abigail's suggestion to democratize the home was the final terrifying piece. It was the realization that the revolution might confound and destroy all distinctions. His core worry was there will be no end of it.
If the principle of equality gets inside the front door, every other structure of authority, parent over child, master over servant, employer over worker, it all collapses.
And that's why those contracts we talked about earlier, marriage and employment, were so important. They are the legal architecture used to preserve this kind of lord-like position of the superior within their private dominion.
So, as the women's rights leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton later said, here is the secret of the opposition to women's equality in the state. Men are not ready to recognize it in the home.
That's it, exactly.
So if this animus against agency is the core, then Edmund Burke, who's often called the father of modern conservatism, he provides the explicit philosophical defense for why that structure is absolutely necessary for order.
Burke is key. Writing in reaction to the French Revolution, he was willing to concede that men have rights. rights to their labor, their inheritance, maybe even a basic education.
But there was a line he wouldn't cross.
A very bright line. The one right he absolutely refused to concede to all men was a share of power, authority, and direction in the management of the state.
And he was very, very clear about who he thought should be excluded from that kind of power.
Oh, extremely clear. This is where you get his most cutting lines. He argues that the occupation of a hairdresser or of a working tallow chandler cannot be a matter of honor to any person.
And therefore,
The state suffers oppression, if such as they, either individually or collectively, are permitted to rule.
so he's saying the very nature of their subordinate work makes them fundamentally unfit for political authority.
Yes. For Burke, hierarchy is order. It's an axiom. He asserts that when the multitude are not under this discipline of the wiser, the more expert, and the more opulent, society can scarcely be said to be in civil society.
So if the multitude gains political agency, it's not just a bad policy choice for him, it's the collapse of society itself.
It's the end of civilization. So you see, Burke isn't just defending inherited tradition in a passive way. He's actively arguing that society requires the subordination of specific people for its basic functioning.
That's a much more dynamic defense of inequality than just a quiet plea for tradition.
It is. It transforms the defense of the powerful into a public good. The master is ruling not for his own sake, but for the sake of the order that everyone, including the subordinate, supposedly depends on.
Okay, let's rewind a bit, back to the 17th century and Thomas Hobbes. Robin frames him not just as a political philosopher, but as maybe the first true counter-revolutionary theorist.
A brilliant political refugee is how he puts it. Hobbes was working during the English Civil War, a period of just intense revolutionary fervor. He had to flee England in 1640 because his work supported absolute monarchy.
But then, ironically, when he came back, he had to flee France because his most famous work, Leviathan, offended the royalists.
Right, because they were still clinging to the divine right of kings. He upset everyone.
He needed a whole new philosophical justification for absolute power, one that didn't rely on shaky theology, especially now that the people were becoming powerful authors of political change.
That was his task, precisely. How do you justify absolute sovereignty while also acknowledging that political power must somehow originate from the people? It's a paradox.
So how does he solve that paradox? How do you get power from the people while denying them any ongoing control over it?
He creates the Leviathan, the sovereign, through a covenant made by the people. The people are the authors of the sovereign's power.
But once that power is created,
They become completely passive. They're the audience, not the cast. As Robin puts it, they are actors without roles. Their only job from that point on is obedience.
and this is a direct challenge to the emerging Republican ideal of liberty that was gaining ground at the time.
A huge challenge. Republicanism, the ideology of the English revolutionaries, defined a slave as anyone who lived under the arbitrary will of his master. It didn't matter if the master was benevolent.
It was the dependence itself that was the problem.
The dependence was slavery. And that perspective required citizens to actively deliberate and participate in government to maintain their freedom.
So Hobbes had to somehow dismantle that entire idea of freedom requires reasoned participation.
And he did it with this revolutionary, materialist account of the will. He argued that the will isn't some high-minded faculty that stands above our passions and judges them.
What is it then?
It is simply the last appetite, or aversion. It's the mechanical inclination that happens immediately before an action.
Okay, let's simplify that. Is he saying that political obedience, even if it's out of pure fear, is still free? Because the desire for survival is just the strongest final impulse acting on your body, making it a mechanical choice, not a reasoned one.
That is exactly the mechanism. The human being is a body in motion, and the will is just the direction of the last motion before you act. It's all mechanistic. And this seemingly abstract philosophical move, that the will is just the winning inclination, that is the core counter-revolutionary maneuver.
And that allows Hobbes to make this genuinely counterintuitive claim. Fear and liberty are consistent. How does he make that stick?
Well, if I obey the ruler because I fear punishment, that obedience is still a free choice. It's based on my strongest inclination, which is self-preservation. My action isn't physically hindered. It's driven by my own internal mechanism.
So I'm still free in the most basic sense.
Therefore, you are free. He defines freedom as just the absence of external impediments of motion. As long as the sovereign hasn't physically chained you to a wall, you're technically free, even if you are bowing and scraping out of pure terror.
The only place genuine freedom exists, then, is wherever the law is silent.
Correct, where the government neither commands nor prohibits. And that's where he says we find the liberty to buy and sell, choose one's own diet, and their own trade of life.
It sounds almost identical to classic modern libertarianism. Freedom is the absence of state restraint, especially in the private economic sphere.
And that marriage between absolute state power and market freedom is fascinating. It's the dark core of Robin's argument here.
The Hobbesian state total submission to the sovereign is the perfect prerequisite for free markets.
You need a state strong enough to enforce contracts and property rights, but most importantly, strong enough to crush any collective movement that demands political agency or, say, wealth redistribution.
And we see this connection play out so vividly much later in the 1970s with figures like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek advising the authoritarian regime of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet.
Yes. They advised Pinochet on how to implement radical free market principles precisely because a heavy hand was needed to break the backs of the labor unions and the left-wing political movements that had previously organized against capital.
There's a quote from Pinochet's finance minister, Sergio de Castro, that just echoes that Hobbesian logic perfectly. He said that a person's actual freedom can only be ensured through an authoritarian regime that exercises power by implementing equal rules for everyone.
It's incredible. And this partnership reveals that the market freedom celebrated by some libertarians often requires, as Robin notes, an enormous amount of repression to create the type of men who can exercise their liberty to buy and sell without getting stroppy.
So the authoritarian state is the necessary guarantor of market freedom because it actively suppresses the political agency of the masses.
That's the argument.
Okay, let's move from the abstract philosophy of Hobbes to the most concrete hierarchical institution in American history. Antebellum slavery provides a terrifying real-world laboratory for how personal mastery is defended and popularized.
The slavery of the American South was distinct from, say, Caribbean plantations or Russian serfdom. A key reason was the high degree of what historians call close cohabitation.
Meaning many slaves lived on small farms with their masters in residence.
Exactly. And this led to an exceptionally personal mode of rule. The master controlled every minute detail of a slave's life. Their name, their partner, their punishment, intricate rules for movement and labor. Total control.
And because of this proximity and total command, the master's entire identity became wrapped up in his mastery.
It wasn't just a means to wealth, it was the definition of who he was.
This explains why the political defense of slavery was so incredibly intense. Calhoun famously argued that slavery had grown up with our society and institutions and is so interwoven with them that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people.
Any threat to slavery was seen as an intolerable assault upon his person. The historian C. Van Woodward noted that for a northern property owner, the end of slavery was the liquidation of an investment.
But for the Southern master,
it was the death of a society. This psychological fusion of man and master explains the intensity or violence of the Southern defense. It wasn't just about economics, it was about their ontological status, their very being.
You're saying the conservatism of the planter class was uniquely volatile because the hierarchy they defended was so intensely personal, woven into the fabric of their daily identity.
Absolutely. The defense of that private dominion was total.
But the planter elite were a minority. To maintain this brutal system, they needed the support of the majority of non-slave-holding white men. They had to make feudal privilege feel democratic.
Yes, this concept of democratic feudalism.
How did they pull that off?
Robin details two dominant schools of thought they used to popularize hierarchy. The first one was basically the equal opportunity for mastery argument.
The idea that anyone can join the club of masters.
That's it. Figures like Daniel Hunley argued that slaveholders were not an exclusive aristocracy. They claimed every free white man in the Union had the right to become an oligarch.
And was that even remotely true?
Well, by 1860, there were 400,000 slaveholders, which made it one of the most democratically accessible master classes in the world at the time. They even talked about tax breaks to encourage farmers to own at least one slave, just to ensure mastery wasn't confined to a small, entrenched elite.
So the pitch was essentially, if you work hard, you too can have someone completely subject to your arbitrary will.
That was the pitch. But the more influential, and ultimately more successful school of thought, was championed by Calhoun, and it was based on racial aristocracy.
This was the definitive counter-revolutionary move to neutralize class conflict among whites.
Absolutely.
How did Calhoun make that argument?
He argued that American slavery was democratic because it eliminated the greatest cause of distinction and separation of the ranks of society among white men. He claimed that society's two great divisions were not rich and poor,
But white and black.
but white and black, which meant every white man, rich or poor, belonged to the upper class. He was an aristocrat simply by skin color.
So this psychological elevation, this universal privilege of whiteness, it harnessed the mass energy of poor whites who might have otherwise revolted against the planter elite.
And it directed that energy outward. They became the staunchest defenders of the hierarchy because their entire identity was built on the subordination of the black population.
That is the ultimate example of securing hierarchy. You just diffuse the privileges of mastery widely enough to stop any subordinate agency from developing internally among the majority. You make the preservation of inequality the central axis of their identity.
A truly powerful strategy.
Let's jump now to the 20th century, to a figure who vehemently denied any connection to conservatism, but whose philosophy, according to Robin, just perfectly captures this reactionary valorization of hierarchy. Ayn Rand.
Rand styled herself as a completely original thinker. She claimed in 1957 to be the most creative thinker alive and that she stood at the end of no tradition, influenced only by Aristotle.
An extraordinary claim.
Especially considering the intellectual ferment of that era. She really cultivated this image of the isolated genius fighting against the mob.
But her fiction, especially Atlas Shrugged, seems to betray that isolation, doesn't it? I mean, her hero, John Galt, delivers his famous speech to millions over the airwaves. He doesn't just write it in a diary.
That's the tension right there. Her goal was the acclamation of the masses, all based on her principle that there are no conflicts of interest among rational men.
The idea being that the genius will eventually be recognized and embraced by everyone who thinks clearly.
She wants both radical independence and universal recognition. It's a tricky balance.
And she claimed to base her entire ethics objectivism, selfishness as a virtue, on Aristotle's law of identity, A is A. Why was that philosophical foundation so problematic, even for her libertarian allies?
Well, critics, including a leading libertarian philosopher like Robert Nozick, found that leap from a basic law of logic, A is A, to detailed ethical and economic principles to be completely unjustified and illegitimate.
Right. You can't derive market principles from the fact that an apple is an apple.
Precisely. As Sidney Hook wrote back in 1961, she tried to deduce not only matters of fact from logic, but with this little warrant, ethical rules and economic truths as well. Robin suggests this was really just a high-minded rationalization for a very specific, fiercely held belief in unequal power.
And that belief in unequal power is rooted in what Robin calls a vulgar Nietzscheanism, this idea that prioritizes ceaseless struggle over comfort.
Rand defines the core value as life. But life itself is characterized as a perpetual, strenuous struggle against death. And this concept of life as struggle provides the moral basis for her elite.
Her exceptional men, the innovators, the intellectual giants, they seize power and wealth. They aren't born into it. They have to prove their entitlement through this rigorous struggle.
So the capitalist is recast as a warrior. They're not some risk-averse manager in an office. They're industrial generals who wrestle the earth's resources and control the means of production. They possess power to command, courage, and fortitude, which she defines as a natural monopoly.
So she's giving the grubby materialists of the market a heroic aristocratic ethos, an ethos that traditional conservatives often felt only belonged to the nobility or the military.
She is. And here is the core reactionary impulse. The capitalist's title to property is defined as a license to dispose of others' labor. The capitalist is, ultimately, a ruler of men, commanding the labor army.
The market becomes this perpetual proving ground where superiority is established through painful and humiliating struggles, justifying the permanent stratification of society based on talent.
It's a meritocratic defense of aristocracy.
It sounds like the system must always be threatening to fail. Otherwise, the hero capitalists can't prove their essential value. Stability is boring.
Stability and altruism are death. Only perpetual struggle justifies the right to rule.
That need to defend hierarchy moves from philosophical fiction to the U.S. Supreme Court with Justice Antonin Scalia. Robin analyzes Scalia's originalism not as some dry legal technique, but as a highly energized emotional defense of inherent inequality.
It's a fascinating take. Scalia is often presented as the quintessential conservative jurist, simply valuing the strict rule of law and the text of the Constitution. But his true motivating force, Robin argues, was a profound desire to resist the spirit of the age.
Meaning the modern progressive tendency toward expansive rights and judicial intervention to fix social ills.
Exactly. And his rigidity, his strict adherence to the law as originally written, that wasn't a constraint on his idealism. It was his idealism.
How does that make sense?
Scalia sought out what he called exhilarating impediments and vertiginous barriers against the fix-it mentality, the mission of making everything come out right or fair by modern standards. His insistence on sticking to outdated constitutional texts, even knowing the social consequences, was an act of political purity for him.
So he saw being orthodox and pious about the law as the essence of dissidence. He wanted to be the tough traditional outsider who had to endure the scorn of the sophisticated world for standing up to progressive trends.
The rigidity made him the exciting outlaw. He wasn't just interpreting the law, he was waging a cultural war from the bench, ensuring that the natural hierarchy he believed in was protected from the forced entry of democracy.
And this philosophy played out perfectly in that 2001 Supreme Court case, PGA Tour Inc. v. Casey Martin.
Yes, the golfer who suffered from a degenerative circulatory disorder and requested to use a golf cart in professional tournaments under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
The PGA refused, saying the cart would fundamentally alter the game. The majority on the court ultimately ruled in Martin's favor.
They did, citing in part that Martin was a customer of the PGA, since he paid entry fees, and that walking wasn't an essential element of the competitive game itself.
And Scalia was incandescent in his dissent.
He was enraged, and his dissent focused so heavily on the majority treating a professional competitor as a mere customer. For Scalia, competitive sport, especially professional golf, is the ideal expression of natural hierarchy.
Why golf, specifically?
Because, as he detailed in his dissent, competitive sport exists to measure and celebrate unevenly distributed excellence. It is a sphere where inequality is natural, visible, and worshipped. It, quote, celebrates the uneven distribution of God-given gifts.
So by requiring an accommodation for Martin's physical condition, the court was demanding that democracy and fairness infiltrate this special preserve of natural aristocracy.
The accommodation was, in Scalia's view, a denial of the intrinsic value of natural superiority. It was the court trying to make everything come out right by ignoring a God-given inequality.
And his famous, bitter concluding line captured that fear perfectly.
The year was 2001 and everybody was finally equal.
That is the judicial manifestation of the animus against subordinate agency. If even the physical sphere of competitive excellence has to bend to egalitarian demands, where can the superior class still rule without challenge?
Exactly. The legal framework was simply the tool he used to preserve a fundamental spiritual belief in the necessity and even the beauty of the unequal distribution of fortune and ability.
Let's shift now to the emotional and rhetorical tools that conservatism uses to mobilize its base. Robin argues that conservatism succeeds brilliantly because it pays fundamentally for the party of the loser, constantly seeking an invigorating struggle.
This is a crucial rhetorical distinction he makes. Conservatives don't speak for the genuinely wretched or the chronically dispossessed, those who never had anything to lose. They speak for the contingently dispossessed.
Which means those who have recently suffered a social loss, the factory owner who lost the right to hire children, the husband who lost unquestioned authority over his wife.
The white person who lost exclusive racial privilege. Precisely. Robin notes that all conservatism begins with loss, and this sense of recent genuine suffering allows conservatives to credibly seek restoration of what was recently owned.
It's a strategically brilliant position.
It is. They aren't merely asking for handouts. They are, in his words, aggrieved because entitled.
So reformers have to convince the disenfranchised that they have rights they never even knew they possessed, which is a very abstract thing. But conservatives are speaking to people who know exactly what they've lost.
And that gives them instant energy. It makes them formidable claimants on our allegiance. It translates a concrete emotional experience, victimhood based on the loss of privilege, into a powerful political engine for restoration and revenge.
This intense emotion, this combination of loss and the need for restoration, it feeds directly into a deep psychological concept that Edmund Burke articulated, which Robin argues is essential to the conservative political drive, the sublime.
Yes, the sublime.
What is the sublime in this context?
Burke defined the sublime as the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. It's awe, but it's tinged with fear and dread. He famously called it delightful horror.
Delightful horror.
It's an arresting, invigorating emotion that makes us feel simultaneously annihilated by some great power and yet magnified in our own sense of self through that confrontation.
Why would a political movement need that feeling? Why isn't quiet satisfaction enough?
Well, Burke worried that quiet enjoyments and peace just generate complacency. They lead to a dull malaise. The assurance of rule is psychologically debilitating. Power, for the superior, must be continuously challenged for their rule to remain real and for them to feel truly alive.
So the status quo is beautiful. It might be sluggish, inert, timid, but it's ultimately boring. The revelation, in its sheer terror, achieves the sublime.
That's the distinction. The French Revolution, in its dynamic violence, achieved the sublime. It was ugly, it was dynamic, it was strong, and this forced the conservatives, as Burke wrote, to be alarmed into reflection. The lesson they learned was that the powerful must subject themselves to danger to maintain their vigor and ardor.
And this explains the conservative preference for activism and confrontation, what Robin calls the no half measures approach.
Think of Winston Churchill's memory of approaching war in Cuba in 1895. He remembered feeling delicious yet tremulous sensations, and feeling that here was a place where real things were going on. Here I might leave my bones.
It's a yearning for meaning and ardor that the comfortable managerial status quo just fails to provide.
The political conflict is pursued not just for policy outcomes, but for the thrill of the fight itself.
And this search for the sublime helps explain the dissatisfaction that emerged even among successful conservatives after the Cold War. The victory of free market affluence was, ironically, boring.
Figures like Irving Kristol, often called the godfather of neoconservatism, worried intensely that American conservatism lacked political imagination. He said the notion of devoting your life to the market was horrifying, if only because it's so repetitious. It's like sex.
They yearned for the epic grandeur of Rome.
Yes, and the heroic ethos of the warrior, which they felt the comfortable bourgeoisie lacked.
So post 9/11, the war on terror wasn't just a reaction to a foreign threat. It was seized upon as a chance for domestic, political, and psychological renewal.
Absolutely. Neoconservatives saw the conflict as a chance to escape what they called the decadent and deadening peace of the previous decades and refocus their lives on a heroic, martial ethos. It provided the gravitas and authority required for a global empire and a satisfying sense of purpose.
But here is the ultimate profound irony that Robin surfaces. The modern state's quest for the sublime through violence is often thwarted by the very structures it relies on.
Yes. The drive for torture and unbridled executive power came primarily from lawyers within the White House and the Justice Department figures like David Addington and John Yoo. And they were fanatics about the law. They insisted that every single act of cruelty had to be justified through a specific and narrowly defined legal framework.
So instead of the blonde beast of prey acting purely on instinct and power, every act of torture became a law school seminar.
Exactly. They debated whether combining approved techniques, like withholding food and turning down the temperature, crossed some never-defined legal threshold. This legal supervision drained the act of its mystery and, therefore, its sublimity.
Burke had warned against this, hadn't he?
He had. He said that if danger and pain press too nearly, if they become clear realities rather than fantasies, the sublime disappears and becomes simply terrible. Robin concludes that the lawyers, by reducing cruelty to a series of legalistic maneuvers, killed the thrill. A clear idea is therefore another name for a little idea.
The ultimate effort to achieve the heroic ethos was neutralized by the bureaucracy required to sustain modern executive power.
A deep, deep irony.
We've established that conservatism is inherently reactive. Rahman notes this makes it a contingent mode of thought, constantly adapting its tactics, often acting as the left's best students.
They possess a tactical virtuosity few can match. They don't rely on some pre-established blueprint. They read and absorb the language of their opponents and then turn it against them to defend hierarchy.
And this adaptation happens both self-consciously as a political strategy and sometimes, unknowingly through what Robin calls elusive osmosis.
The post-civil rights shift in the Republican Party, the Southern strategy, is the textbook example of this tactical virtuosity. Overt racial appeals were delegitimized after the 1960s.
H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, famously noted that Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to.
And Lee Atwater, the master Republican strategist of that era, laid out the evolution of this coded language so clearly in 1981. He explained that in the 1950s, you could say nigger.
But by 1968, you can't. So you shift to forced busing, states' rights, you're getting more abstract.
And the final shift is complete abstraction, moving entirely to economic policy.
Right. You shift, again, to talking purely about cutting taxes, knowing the economic effect is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. The argument is now focused on fiscal prudence, a neutral concept, even though the intent and the effect are to maintain the racial hierarchy.
And this is where Robin introduces that fascinating idea of elusive osmosis. Atwater suggested that because the language had become so abstract, talking about taxes instead of racism, the disguise itself might eventually transform the intention.
The abstract language eventually dictates the terms of thought, even for the political strategists themselves.
It's a chilling point about the power of abstraction in politics. The original reactionary animus is still there, but it's fought under an entirely new, sanitized linguistic banner.
You see this replicated everywhere now, like when conservative commentators advise students to use the left's language of intellectual diversity, hostile learning environment, and underrepresented viewpoints to attack liberal academia.
They're using the master's tools.
And the strategic absorption of the opponent's language was applied perfectly against the women's movement to defend that private domain, the democratic feudalism of the home.
Phyllis Schlafly, in her fight against the Equal Rights Amendment, is the case study. She was initially unconcerned until feminism started touching the intensely personal relations between the sexes.
And then she led the counter-revolution by framing her opposition not as anti-equality, but as a defense of women's existing rights.
She argued the ERA was a takeaway of women's rights. Specifically, it would take away the right of the wife in an ongoing marriage, the wife in the home.
She weaponized the liberal language of entitlement rights.
Absolutely. She claimed the wife had the right to be supported by her husband, even if she was economically capable of working. By framing the husband as a kind of private welfare state, the lord who provides protection, she successfully reinforced the traditional dependence of the wife upon the master of the private dominion.
That's the ultimate tactical virtuosity, taking the left's most powerful tool, rights talk, and using it to build a higher fence around traditional hierarchies.
It's an incredible maneuver.
So let's bring it all together. This deep dive into Robin's The Reactionary Mind shows that conservatism is not simply a quiet defense of the old ways.
Not at all. It is a dynamic, highly activist political doctrine, constantly attempting its rhetoric and redefining core concepts like liberty and rights, all in service of one thing: countering the political agency of subordinate groups.
From Hobbes redefining freedom as mere mechanistic submission, to antebellum masters establishing a racial aristocracy, to Scalia defending competitive sports as the sacred celebration of unequal God-given gifts.
The animating core is the resistance to being judged, challenged, or made redundant by those below you.
It is a political impulse driven as much by the material protection of privilege as by a psychological need for invigorating conflict, that quest for the sublime, which prefers political ardor and struggle over the perceived boring decadence of peaceful affluence.
Which leads us to Robin's final provocative thought. He suggests that conservatism's greatest weakness might just be its overwhelming success.
How so?
Because it's defined by reaction. It thrives on being alarmed into reflection by a strong left. The disappearance of threatening, organized social movements leaves the movement philosophically flabby and intellectually moribund.
So if the right has already defeated the major revolutions it set out to fight, if socialism, communism, and the Great Society are deemed defeated, the source of its creative dynamic energy disappears.
And the question for you, the listener, is this. When a political impulse is defined by reaction, what happens when it finally runs out of genuine revolutions to fight against? Does it turn inward, or does it begin fabricating external enemies to keep the engine running?
And as you critically analyze political arguments going forward, whether they invoke freedom or loss, always question what form of hierarchy or inequality is being protected or advanced under that banner. That is the true takeaway of Robin's analysis.